Here is what I keep returning to. Just one plain observation. The architectural record of the 19th century contains buildings whose construction timelines, material sourcing, and labor demands make no coherent sense under any known industrial condition of that era. These are not obscure structures at the margins of history. We are talking about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, an entire neoclassical city raised in under 2 years, Capitol buildings, grand train stations, hospital complexes, structures with dome spans and stone intricacies that modern engineers openly admit would take decades to replicate today. The official explanation is essentially this: the unique combustion of capitalism, industrial ambition, and motivated labor produced architectural miracles. It is a reasonable explanation. It flatters the era. It fits the familiar narrative of American and European progress, and most people accept it without needing to look any closer than the surface. I accepted it too for a long time. There is nothing wrong with accepting it. It is internally consistent, and the historians who built the argument were, by and large, serious people working from serious sources. The question is not whether those historians were honest. The question is whether the sources they were given were complete. Now, let me talk about Tartaria, or more precisely, about the place that maps once called Tartaria, and what happened to it. Because the architectural question and the cartographic question are not two separate problems. They are, I have come to believe, the same problem wearing different faces in different centuries. The connection between the two is not obvious at first. The architectural anomalies sit in one field. The cartographic erasure sits in another. But the more precisely you describe what is missing from each, the more clearly they begin to share a single outline. The outline of something deliberately removed from the historical record in the same coordinated motion. On virtually every major European map produced between the 16th and 18th centuries, there exists a vast territory labelled Tartaria, Tartary, or Grand Tartary. It stretches across what we now call Siberia, Central Asia, and large portions of the Far East. The cartographers responsible, Gerardus Mercator, Nicolas Sanson, Hermann Moll, were the scientific standard of their time. The mainstream explanation is not unreasonable. Historians will tell you Tartaria was a loose European label, a cartographic umbrella term applied to poorly understood peoples of Central and Northern Asia. They will say it was never a unified empire, and that its disappearance from maps reflects nothing more than improved geographic knowledge, filling in the blanks. That consensus deserves to be taken seriously, because it is genuinely coherent. It explains the label's origin and why imprecise designations get replaced by more precise categories over time. It requires no suppression, no hidden hand. It is exactly the kind of explanation that should satisfy a careful thinker until the specific details arrive. Here is the first crack, and I want you to notice how small it is. By the late 17th century, maps produced by the French cartographer Guillaume Delisle, one of the most methodologically rigorous geographers of his era, depict Tartaria not as a vague ethnic region, but as a structured territory with distinct internal divisions, named cities and recognized political zones. The level of detail matters. The maps do not gesture vaguely at a populated interior. They record administrative hierarchies, road networks connecting named settlements, and internal provincial boundaries consistent with a recognized political entity. This is the precision that European cartographers reserved for sovereignties they understood to be real, not for ethnographic approximations. That is not the cartographic behavior of a loose umbrella label. Ethnographic terms do not receive administrative subdivisions with distinct internal governance. Geographic imprecision does not generate road networks between named cities. What the late 17th century maps recorded, in the rigorous language of their discipline, looked far more like an organized political entity than a vague European gesture toward unknown peoples, and then it disappears. Not gradually, the way geographic understanding evolves, not with the slow refinement and reassignment of labels, but with a sudden completeness difficult to explain through the natural pace of cartographic revision. By the early 19th century, Tartaria has not been reclassified or refined. It has been replaced uniformly and entirely. I want to follow the pattern carefully, because its weight lies not in any single point, but in what accumulates. The historian Daniel Boorstin documented in The Discoverers how the systematic replacement of geographic knowledge became a primary instrument of colonial territorial legitimacy. He was not speaking of Tartaria specifically, but the mechanism he described fits with uncomfortable precision. Consider the early 18th century, when Peter the Great began expanding Russian imperial authority eastward. One of his first institutional acts was the founding of a centralized cartographic apparatus designed explicitly to standardize the mapping of Russian territorial claims. This occurred in the same generation that immediately preceded the systematic disappearance of the Tartarian label from Russian adjacent maps. I am not drawing a straight line from that single data point. One institutional moment does not prove an erasure. But I am noting the timing and noting that the geographic entity most directly threatened by a consolidating Russian imperial identity was precisely the one that ceased to appear on maps within the same historical window. Consider the Jesuit records. Jean-Baptiste du Halde, a French Jesuit scholar who compiled the most comprehensive European account of China's interior, published his Description géographique in 1735. In it, he describes cities in the Central Asian interior with civic and architectural sophistication, quietly at odds with the official portrait of the region as ungoverned and primitive. These records were not hidden. They were published, translated, and circulated widely. They were cited for decades after publication. And then, somewhere in the 19th century, they ceased to anchor the mainstream historical literature on Central Asia in the way their detail and first-hand derivation logically demanded. They were not destroyed. They were quietly de-emphasized. The mechanism of de-emphasis is worth understanding because it is quieter and more effective than outright suppression. Du Halde's work was never banned. It was gradually cited less, summarized rather than examined, reduced over time from a primary source about Central Asian civic reality to a footnote about Jesuit ambition. The record remained. Its authority was quietly reassigned. Now I want to bring you back to the buildings, because this is where the two threads begin to pull against each other. A class of analysis has noted that many grand 19th century public structures share characteristics more consistent with a prior, unknown construction tradition than with the industrial methods officially credited for producing them. I know what that sounds like, and I want to engage with the skepticism because it is valid. The argument risks circular reasoning, deciding the conclusion first, then finding supporting details. That is a real methodological danger, and I hold it honestly. But the mainstream counterargument carries its own vulnerabilities, and they deserve direct examination. The United States Capitol extensions, completed in the 1860s, required a workforce for which no full contemporaneous employment records have ever been located. Historians cite bureaucratic discontinuity and record loss. That explanation is not wrong, but the incompleteness falls most acutely on precisely the records that would complicate the official construction narrative. I want to be careful here. The absence of records is not evidence of suppression. Records from the 19th century are incomplete for many unremarkable reasons: fire, negligence, administrative disorganization. Naming a gap is not the same as proving it was intentionally made. I am aware of that distinction, and I am holding it throughout. What I am not willing to do is pretend the gaps fall randomly. When you map the incompleteness across institutions, across English colonial archives, Russian imperial records, American federal construction offices, and French academic cartographic societies, the pattern of what is missing is not random. It is concentrated. It clusters around the same category of question, the same type of architectural origin record, the same class of pre-19th century map detail, the same genre of eyewitness account describing civic complexity in regions later classified as primitive. These institutions competed with one another across centuries. They agreed on very little, and yet their silences organized themselves, consistently, around the same category of subject. You have to understand what it takes for that to happen accidentally. Competing archives, operating across different nations and institutional mandates, would have to independently preserve the same types of records and lose the same types without any communication about which types were which. The probability is not merely low, it is structurally implausible. Here is the argument I find hardest to set aside. If the pattern was simply the product of independent institutional oversight spread across nations and centuries with no shared mechanism, you would expect irregular distribution, some over-recording, some under-recording, silences distributed without discernible theme. That is not what the record looks like. What it looks like is directed not by a named conspiracy, but by a shared institutional interest requiring no explicit coordination. Every emerging nation-state in the 18th and 19th centuries needed to be the recognized origin point of its claimed civilization. A prior claimant on the same territory is not an inconvenience, it is an existential threat. Power does not require a meeting, it only requires a direction. The direction here, toward a world with no civilization preceding the one currently consolidating itself, was shared by every institution that stood to benefit from it. That is not a conspiracy. It is something quieter and in some ways more troubling, a convergence of self-interest so complete it needed no architect. I have been asked, and I have asked myself, whether this amounts to anything more than a selective reading of institutional failure. The answer I keep arriving at is that the selectivity itself is the evidence. If the failures were random, they would not be selective. If they were random, the pattern would not point. The pattern points. Now I want to come to the question of frequency, because it is the portion of this investigation most vulnerable to overreach, and I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am beginning with a documented figure, not a speculative one. John Ernst Worrell Keeley conducted experiments in Philadelphia between the 1870s and 1890s, describing what he called resonant vibrational physics, a model in which material structures could be designed to transmit and concentrate harmonic energy at specific frequencies. His work was contemporaneously documented, contested, and eventually suppressed by the scientific establishment of his era. The discrediting was aggressive and thorough. The scientific establishment dismissed Keeley primarily through institutional voices, with financial and ideological reasons to do so. Whether his results were genuinely replicable, the historical record on that question remains contested, is less interesting to me than the speed and totality of the dismissal, and what the dismissal was protecting against. Because what Keeley was gesturing toward architecture designed to operate harmonically, to transmit and concentrate frequency through material form, is the same class of knowledge that the Central Asian interior's architectural record pointed toward in the same historical window through entirely different institutional channels on the other side of the world. I cannot prove these two threads are connected. What I can say is that the specific category of knowledge being suppressed in both cases is identical. A knowledge of physical reality operating on principles other than those the 19th century was in the process of codifying as official science. Whatever Tartaria knew, if it knew anything, it occupied that exact category. And that raises the hardest question in this entire investigation. Not what was suppressed, but why that specific category. Not military technology, not territorial maps useful to colonial expansion. The category being suppressed was resonant and acoustic, a knowledge of how the physical world vibrates. That specificity is not random. I have not been able to explain it away. Let me address the mud flood theory directly, because it is the point where careful listeners tend to disengage, and I want to earn the right to raise it by being honest about its weaknesses first. In its popular form, the theory is largely speculative, and many examples used to support it do not withstand geographic scrutiny. But beneath the speculation is a documented phenomenon: the systematic lowering of street grades in dozens of American and European cities in the mid to late 19th century. This process left hundreds of structures with their original ground floors below the new street level, original entrances bricked over or abandoned underground. Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, and Boston are the most documented examples. The official explanation is urban planning and sanitation. It is not wrong, and it accounts for the process, but it does not explain why cities thousands of miles apart, under different governments and different municipal philosophies, arrived at nearly identical solutions in nearly identical timeframes and found officially nothing significant in the ground beneath the old street level. What the records consistently show is a decision, uniform, rapid, largely undocumented in its findings, to raise the street grade and move forward. The engineering rationale is clear. What is less clear is the institutional indifference to what the original level contained. You do not lower an entire city's street grade without encountering the prior foundations in detail. If there was a civilization before the one we know, call it Tartaria, or whatever name lets you take the question seriously, the most urgent question is not what it built, or even how it ended, it is what it understood. Because every category of erasure I have described points toward the same category of knowledge. A knowledge of the relationship between material structure and invisible frequency. A knowledge of geography that contradicted the territorial story the 19th century required. A knowledge encoded in buildings, maps, and acoustic experiments, dangerous not for any military reason, but because it was prior, because its existence made the official origin story of civilization impossible to maintain. I want to say clearly that I do not have a conclusion. I am standing before a pattern, not an answer. What I have is a set of anomalies that refuse to dissolve under standard explanations, and a uniformity of silence across institutions, nations, and centuries more organized than silence has any right to be. What I have is the recognition that the history I was given, beginning in Greece, accelerating through Rome, igniting in Europe, arriving at the present as its own inevitable conclusion, may have been written not from the beginning of the story, but from somewhere in the middle of it, by people with specific reasons to insist that nothing came before. Think about what that means in practice. Every institution teaching history in the 19th century, universities, academies, newly founded museums, encyclopedic projects like the Encyclopedia Britannica, was simultaneously arriving at the same origin stories, not similar ones, the same ones, as if they were all working across languages and nations from the same editorial brief. Somewhere between the maps that named a vast civilization and the maps that showed empty steppe, something happened. The buildings are still standing. The frequencies are still measurable in structures whose acoustic properties cannot be explained by the methods officially credited for their construction. What lay beneath the lowered street grades was never formally catalogued, and I keep returning to the same question, not dramatically, but quietly, the way you ask something when you are not sure you want the answer. If the victors rewrote every history book, every atlas, every archive, every stone foundation relabeled, and every prior name erased, what would the world we are living in look like from the inside? I don't have an answer. I'm not sure any answer would close this anymore. What I know is that the pattern has a shape, and it is specific, and it points in one direction. Somewhere between the first map that named Tartaria and the last one that didn't, a door was found. Whether it was ever opened, no record says,